So hello everyone, and welcome. My name's Simon Ellis, and together with Lily Hayward-Smith and Kate Marsh, the three of us are responsible for curating what's known as DaRE Invites. Each year we have a kind of a theme. This particular series is called The Body and Science, and we're welcoming Emily Cross. But I just wanted to share one of the things that made us curious about this as a possible theme, the body and science. And I'm going to ruin Albert Einstein. He was talking about mathematics, but this is quoting him, and I'm replacing the word mathematics with science. Insofar as the propositions of science give an account of reality, they are not certain, and insofar as they are certain, they do not describe reality. And so there's something about this kind of question of the possibilities and limits of science in relation to the human body that is particularly interesting to us here at the Centre for Dance Research at Coventry. So a big welcome to you all again, and in particular, welcome to you, Emily Cross. Emily is, this is just the first little part of your bio, which everyone would have received anyway when they signed up, but Emily is a dancer and cognitive neuroscientist by training, and leads the Professorship for Social Brain Sciences at ETH Zurich in Zurich in Switzerland. Emily leads a vibrant and diverse research team that uses brain imaging techniques, robots, and complex learning paradigms, often involving dance, to explore how experience-dependent plasticity and expertise is manifest across brain and behavior, and the effective value of performing arts. And it did make me think, as I was reading that out, how much I would love the word robots in my CV at some point, but
you can
not
do it.
yet. I can do it. Just stick it in there, right? So Emily, a huge welcome to you. Really looking forward to this. Just to let everyone know what's going to happen is Emily's going to talk for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. She and I are going to have a little bit of back and forth, a conversation based on that presentation. We'll take a little pit stop there. We'll have about 2 to 5 minutes break, and then we'll come back and have questions as a group. So Emily, Lily, if you want to spotlight Emily, and then.
All right, I can share my screen here. We'll get there eventually. Oh, I see the spinning wheel of death. Never a good sign, but let's see if we can. All right, can everyone see that? Are we good?
Yep.
Great.
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Thumbs up. You can hear me. Fantastic. All right. I'm going to just kind of minimize this a bit so I can actually see the time. Okay. If anyone wants to interrupt me while I'm speaking because I've minimized this on the screen a little bit, just sing out, shout out. It's totally cool. I might not see hands waving or chats come up. But I'd like to begin by saying a huge thank you to Simon for the invitation, to Simon and Lily for organizing this today. It is really a pleasure to be here. I had the great pleasure as well of hosting one of your own CDAR members, Louisa, who I see online too. Hello, Louisa, here at our lab in ETH, right when we got started here last summer. And it was all a bit chaotic and not coming together quite yet, but it was still really nice to kind of hear about some of the work that at least one of your fantastic representatives is doing, and to, understand that there's this fantastic center in Coventry that's really looking at dance research from a holistic 360-degree perspective. That's why it's such a treat for me to be able to share, a small piece of my work that hopefully will be of interest to folks here. I also really like that Simon began the whole lecture today with a quote from Albert Einstein, because Albert Einstein is the most famous alumnus from this very university where I'm sitting now. And I just came about 5 minutes ago from an advanced ballet class, which is in the very building where Einstein used to be a student and also lecture. So, it's all coming full circle. We have Einstein in the brain, we have Einstein in the body, and we're going to talk about some dancing brains and thinking bodies today. So I'd like to begin kind of how I couple together science and dance by couching my research questions within kind of a big and broad context. Simon read you a few lines from my bio. It was about experience, it was about plasticity, it was about kind of agents that we see in this world, whether they're humans or robots or dancers, the most exquisite kind of humans you might have. But to kind of take one step back and place this research in, perhaps an even more universal and broad context. There's this idea that in our daily lives, we're pretty much constantly moving our bodies, whether that's to get from point A to B, whether it's to dance, whether it's to raise a hand, whether it's to click on a button on your computer to say you'd like to ask a question in Zoom during this lecture. All of these require body movements. We also can have, highly sophisticated body movements, such as those required to compete in sports, to dance, to build a house, any number of things that we can think of. These involve our bodies moving through space. So that's all well and good, but it's not just the case that we're moving our bodies. We're also spending a lot of time and energy kind of making sense of other people moving their bodies. So we're watching others to understand, is that person going to cross the street while I'm driving? Should I slow down for them, or are they going to wait there? Do I need to hold the door for this person, or are they going to be slow? There's all manner of things that we can do as well that involve us seeing what others are doing with their bodies, and then making sure our actions are appropriate and coordinated with them. So how are we able to do this? Well, this is a question that has fascinated venerable scholars, at least since the time of Aristotle, including Aristotle, René Descartes, William James, the founder of modern psychology, and many other scientists beside have been really interested in how can we make this link between, movements that we do with our own body and how we make sense of others. And there was a discovery now nearly 20 years ago that many of you have probably heard of, because I know this is of relevance and interest to the dance community, a discovery of mirror neurons. And they weren't actual neurons that stood in front of a mirror like that, but as some of you will probably know, these were neurons that were located originally within the premotor and inferior parietal lobule of the non-human primate brain. So these are originally found in the monkey brain. And these are neurons that respond in a very similar, though not identical way, to actions that are executed and actions that are perceived. So when these were found about 20 years ago by Giacomo Rizzolatti and his colleagues at the University of Parma, this was the very first neurophysiological evidence we had at the cellular level that action and perception kind of share this common substrate. These cells code both action and perception. So since that discovery, again, I probably not need to tell anyone hear this because you're all familiar with it. There's been a lot of interest in what these mirror neurons mean and what do they underpin? Is it just kind of action and perception, or does it also tell us something about emotions that we feel and emotions that we observe in others, empathy, autism, language? They've kind of been extended to, quite a few things beyond just this action perception coupling. What I'm interested in, though, is this action perception coupling. I think it is really interesting and fundamental to everyday life, not just in dance contexts, but I think it's very interesting in dance contexts as well. And this idea, since the discovery of mirror neurons, we can talk about a mirror neuron system in the human brain. I actually prefer to use the terminology action observation network. I think it's a little more agnostic about individual cells and what they're doing. It's just a semantic preference, though. So you can kind of, in your head, if I say action observation network, you can think, yeah, this is brain regions that are kind of involving mirror neuron type properties. Yes, so, and this idea is that's been proposed by Rizzolatti and his colleagues and many others besides, are that actions are understood by this direct matching process. So I can understand what you're doing with your body, whether it's, running to catch the bus, raising your hand to ask a question, pouring yourself a cup of coffee, because I've embodied those experiences myself. And I can, draw on that embodied experience to make sense of you. And this is nothing that requires effort and deep amounts of thinking. It's just something that we are highly evolved to do quite easily. So that's all well and good, and kind of from a big, broad perspective, hopefully that makes sense. But then a question that I get asked a lot is, well, you study dance. I see dance occur, appears in your CV, and this is something that you've, a lot of your paper titles, a lot of your abstracts, your bio, you talk about dance a lot. So why do you use dance? If you're interested in, action perception, action production, and yes, we do a lot with aesthetics as well, and I'll talk a little bit about aesthetics today as well, because we're not just interested in aesthetics for aesthetics' sake. We're interested in the role of the body in aesthetics and embodied experience. So why would dance be interesting and relevant in these domains and for these questions? Well, if you kind of go to Google Scholar or PubMed or any kind of online citation repository and kind of look up the something having to do with the relationship between action and perception and what we know about that in terms of the brain, in terms of the body, you'll see that most of the work in this space has really taken place focused on small constrained movements of the hands and fingers. So whether this is drawing, finger pressing, gestures, all these sorts of things, performing, perceiving, there are hundreds, if not thousands, no, probably thousands of papers that kind of are asking questions about action perception, action production links in the human brain, and using hand actions. So most, like probably 95% of work is in that space. And that's all well and good because we use our hands a lot, and hands are, our hand actions are incredibly important in human. We are much more than just our hands. We have bodies. We have bodies that move through space, and we have bodies that are able to achieve incredibly complex movements, actions, and coordinated behaviors with other people. So what I've done with my team is we've kind of said, yep, hand actions, great, really interesting. We're going to leave those for other researchers, and we're going to focus on the entire other end of the complexity spectrum. And we're going to ask questions about whole body movements, and not just any whole body movements. We're going to look at very complex, often difficult to learn or difficult to perform movements that we find often in dance. So that's kind of why we focus on dance, is to kind of build up that complexity spectrum and our understanding of how action perception and action production are linked, but not just with what's going on from the wrist and to our fingertips. So yes, we really focus on dance, and we found this to be a really, really useful test case. We found dancers to be a wonderful population to study in this, because we can look a lot about how lifelong experience starts to shape these relationships too. So we have been exploring perception and embodiment through two main approaches. So we've been asking how experience shapes perception, both from a long-standing experience or expertise perspective. So this is when we have dancers come into our laboratory who have trained for years and years and years before they ever meet us. And then, we can kind of either compare them to people who do not have lifelong, years and years of dance expertise, or we can kind of ask questions about, okay, if you start with this baseline level of expertise, how does, your brain change? How does your perception change as we give you even more experience? But then we also do something quite different, which is we invite non-dancers, we invite people who don't have any dance experience, formal. Maybe they, go dancing in clubs usually, but we even try to screen for that. But then we invite these people in who don't have a great interest and certainly not a lot of engagement in dance to our laboratory, and we train them to dance through lab-based dance training tasks. And I'm sure you probably do very sophisticated things, or could do very sophisticated things there in Coventry for dance training. But what we've relied on in the past are more dance video games, which, I won't see your face if you kind of cringe and say that's awful, that's not real dance. But I hope you'll be convinced by the end that it's actually kind of a useful tool for kind of giving people some sort of movement with music, and kind of a rewarding experience in that way that allows us to ask some of these questions. So I'm going to talk about kind of two different parts of our dance and aesthetics research that we've done. Some studies from it, we've done quite a few, but I'll kind of pick out a few just to highlight today for our conversation. The one question that we're going to look at in the expertise domain concerns how action expertise changes how we see other people moving around us. So how does what I can do with my own body change how I see what you're doing with your own body? And then, oh gosh, my spacing has gone funny here. I think my presentation decided to change from like normal format to widescreen just 5 minutes ago, but bear with me here. Also going to ask some questions about aesthetics and embodiment, as I mentioned a moment ago. And this is, our questions here concern the relationship between aesthetic enjoyment and, again, what it is we can actually do ourselves. And some, I think, interesting insights are coming out in that space. So first of all, this question about expertise shaping perception. A question we might have is, how does the acquisition of expertise through, in this case, weeks of physical practice, shape the brain of the learner when this learner watches those same actions? So you might ask this question, like if you have these chaps in a dance class here, let's say it's an intro to breakdancing class, what's when these guys watch breakdancing, how is their brain activity going to look different when they're at day one of the class versus they're 4 years into training and they're performing on stage and watching something like you see in the picture on the right? Obviously, it's going to be quite a different experience, and it's from a phenomenological perspective, but we also had an inkling that it'll be quite different from a neurophysiological perspective as well. So there's been quite a few studies now in this space, but one of the first and most important and most famous ones, which I'm sure many of you will know about, was performed by the fantastic Beatriz Calvamarino and colleagues and published back in 2005. And again, I don't know what's going on with my capitalizations. Please understand that I know how to capitalize citations, but my presentation's gone a bit wonky. Anyways, Beatriz, whose name should be properly capitalized, Calvamarino, she and her colleagues were the first to kind of ask this question. And they asked this question by putting expert dancers in the scanner, as well as a control group of non-dancers. And the dancers were both from an expert ballet dancer population and an expert capoeira dancer population. And each of these populations watched a bunch of videos while their brains were being scanned. Some were of ballet dancers dancing ballet, and some were of capoeira dancers dancing capoeira. So both of these groups had great expertise, but they only had expertise in one of the movement styles. And what these researchers found is that when you as an expert dancer are watching that type of movement that you have this lifelong embodied expertise with, we get more robust engagement of this action observation network or the mirror neuron system. You can see kind of a schematic of the left hemisphere of the brain above the two dance pictures there. And just those numbers are pointing out kind of parts of the premotor and the parietal cortex, which are kind of corresponding to where mirror neurons were originally found in monkeys. And we know that expertise is kind of resulting in more engagement of those regions. So kind of more blood flow to them, more activity. Around the same time, my colleagues and I were running a study with expert dancers as well, but this is with expert contemporary dancers. This was a long time ago. This was the first study I did during my PhD. But what we did is we had these expert contemporary dancers, and they weren't just kind of watching movement they're familiar with or unfamiliar with, kind of with nothing else going on. But these were dancers in a dance company. It was the company that I was actually dancing in at the time. And we were learning this complex new choreographic work. So each week, the dancers would come in across a 6-week period, and they'd watch some choreography that they'd been learning across the past week. Then they'd watch some kinematically similar choreography that they had no experience with. And we asked them to kind of rate how well they could embody these movements. And what we see kind of nicely corresponding to what Calvin Marino and colleagues found, and now many people have found since, is that when you're watching movement that you are actually practicing and that you're really good at doing yourself, we get kind of more amplified engagement of two regions of this action observation or mirror neuron system in particular. And it doesn't look terribly exciting with this kind of inflated left hemisphere brain schematic with the two orange dots. But those two orange dots are really kind of the core regions where mirror neurons were found. We have premotor cortex, ventral motor cortex, and inferior parietal lobule. And this is really kind of like these are the regions that are linking action and perception. And what we're showing here is that they're also giving us a neural signature for embodiment. So the better you are, the more these regions are amplifying. It's not just have I done it or not, it's how good am I? How much am I actually embodying it? So that was a pretty exciting kind of piece that we were able to add to this question about the neurobiological signatures of embodiment and expertise. Another kind of piece that we've added in this direction has to do with not just kind of expertise, can I do it, can I not, but what's going on in terms of the affective or the emotional responses in observers. So we know that when we watch others in action, even really simple actions, so even me kind of speaking and gesturing like this, but also reaching to grab a cup of coffee, or even very pedestrian things, these really, everything from simple to very complex actions can and do also elicit emotional responses in observers. So we wanted to know the extent to which emotional responses in observers, as well as explicit ratings of aesthetics or enjoyment, are influenced by a viewer's expertise when they view movement. So to answer this question, we invited in expert dancers and non-dancers, and we recorded some activity from muscles in their face. So we're not doing brain scanning this time, but we're using something called facial electromyography, or EMG. And essentially, we have a pair of electrodes just on the cheek here and a pair of electrodes on the eyebrow. And these are recording over muscles known as the corrugator muscles. This is your eyebrow muscle, and that's a muscle that's engaged when you're frowning or concentrating or kind of like not necessarily having a super pleasant experience. And then we had the zygomaticus muscle, and perhaps not surprisingly, this is one of many muscles that's involved and one of the chief muscles involved in smiling. So if you're watching something pleasant, even if you don't have a great big grin on your face, but just something that's mildly pleasant, we'll see more engagement of the zygomaticus muscle. And this is a really important point to make. Facial EMG isn't about recording what's going on when someone's going like this or like going like this. You can see those facial expressions. We don't need special tools. Essentially, as someone's watching some videos on a screen, their face looks completely neutral, completely impassive, nothing's going on. What these electrodes allow us to do is see, like, okay, we can't see you smiling or frowning, but is there like anything kind of going on underneath the surface that gives us an indication that there's like a pre-smile or a pre-frown or a pre kind of engagement of one of these sets of muscles? So as I said, we had 25 expert dancers, we had 26 dance naive young adults who were age matched, and these participants watched a whole bunch of dance videos. Um, we had about 88 videos, I believe, that were filmed from dancers from the Leipzig Ballet. Each video was 3 seconds long, and they ranged in complexity from like really simple to very complex. And there was ballet choreography, there was contemporary vocabulary, there was kind of the dancers were just allowed to kind of freestyle, and we chopped that up into very small snippets, which was important for how we record our data. Um, and we had everyone watch these videos. And what we had our dancers and our non-dancers do is just watch them one time and like not do anything except a really simple attentional task. Then we had them watch them a second time and assign ratings as to how much they enjoyed watching them. And it was really important that we have them watch it once first without thinking about how much they like them, because that gives us a much clearer kind of implicit understanding of how people are evaluating movements without having to like effortfully think about how much do I like this. So what we saw, if we're going to look at some traces now across the time period, the 3 seconds that each of these little dance clips ran, and these traces are going to show what's going on when people are watching dance movies that they later put and kind of sorry, they later assign high ratings of liking to, or they later assign low ratings of liking to. So we can kind of go back and look at what's going on in these muscles when people are watching movies they later say like, yeah, I kind of liked watching that, or they later say, yeah, that was quite dull or boring. What we can see here first are our non-dancers. So we have the traces in blue are showing what's going on when they're watching movies that they later say, I like those. And the traces in red are what's going on in these muscles when when they're watching movies that they later say they didn't like so much. And you can see here with our non-dancers that these red and blue traces are kind of right on top of each other. So there's not really a lot going on to pull apart the smiling muscle or the frowning muscle activity among our non-expert viewers. However, when our expert dancers are watching, we do see some clear water emerge between the muscle traces in the zygomaticus muscle and in the corrugator muscle, such that when our dancers are watching these dance clips that they later say, I really, really liked watching that, we can see that that blue trace is higher just for the zygomaticus muscle. And then when they're watching those videos that they later say, oh, those are quite boring and dull, you can see that the corrugator muscle is showing a more robust response in our dancing population only. So I really don't know what's going on with the capitalization, but never mind. The data show you that, yeah, we can see this evidence that embodiment kind of gives you more of a kind of implicit emotional response when you're watching movies, having to do with your area of expertise. And this is dancers watching dance here. Now, a bunch of you dancers in the audience might be like, well, duh, of course that's going to happen. But you know what, this from a scientific perspective, this wasn't clear that it would happen. And I think it does add a nice piece of evidence to say that, you know, embodiment kind of has impacts, you know, throughout so many things, not just what we can do with our bodies, but even like how we emotionally process things. So, what we can conclude from these first two studies is that physical expertise shapes perception in terms of sharpening these responses within brain areas that link action and perception. That's what we saw with our expert dancers and kind of the longitudinal brain scanning study, and also amplifying subtle facial expressions of emotion when we observe others in action. This is what we saw with our facial EMG study. So now we'll switch gears a little bit and have just a few minutes talking about the neuroaesthetics of dance, because this is a topic that neuroaesthetics is becoming a more and more kind of well-established field. But the neuroaesthetics of dance remains kind of often forgotten little sister in this discipline. And there's some of us, including Beatrice Calvamarino and Guido Orgs and several others, Julia Christensen, who are really fighting to make sure that the neuroaesthetics of dance is kind of given its fair due as a really valuable and worthwhile research endeavor. So what neuroaesthetics is, for any of you who've not heard this term before, simply put, it's your brain on art. It's what are the neurobiological foundations of an aesthetic experience you might have. Now, empirical aesthetics does not concern itself solely with beauty and pleasant aesthetic experience, but I should say that neuroaesthetics kind of picks off the piece of empirical aesthetics that is the pleasant side. So, kind of trying to evaluate the neurobiological responses from a rewarding aesthetic experience, and to maybe comparing to ones that are less rewarding, rather than the joy you might get from being afraid or really sad or these sorts of things. There's a little bit of work in that space, but most neuroaesthetics is looking at the positive uh, associations we get from partaking in art. So in terms of neuroaesthetics and dance, um, when this field kind of just started to get going just over 10 years ago, there were questions about, well, when we watch paintings, or sorry, when we view paintings or look at sculpture, we know that there's visual regions involved. We know that there's some affective kind of emotion regions involved. But there was some questions about, well, when we see dance, is it just going to be kind of these visual and reward processing brain regions that are kind of underpinning our response to a pleasant aesthetic experience, or could there be a role for the body as well? And this is kind of given us over to this idea of embodied neuroaesthetics. The second word seems to have been dropped there, but embodied neuroaesthetics is what we're after. And this is what my team and I have really been looking at over the past decade or so to understand, how does the body shape aesthetic experiences? You saw a little bit in that last study I just showed you with the face responses, but we've been trying to address this with a bunch of different tools from a bunch of different perspectives. The first study we did um, kind of gave us the notion of something that we later ended up calling the Cirque du Soleil effect. And I think it's a very intuitive effect, but it was kind of nice to show this empirically. And essentially what we had people do here, we had dance naive observers look at these 3-second video clips that we use a lot from the Leipzig ballet dancers, and they had to answer one of two questions after each video. They either had to answer, how much did you like watching the video you just saw, or how well could you perform the movements you just saw? So you didn't know which question you'd ask. You'd watch a movie, and then a question would come up saying like question mark, and you have to answer on a 1 to 4 scale, or it would say perform question mark, and you'd have to answer on a 1 to 4 scale. And in this way, we can start to get an understanding of what the relationship is between liking and doing. And what we found, just behaviorally here, is this quite robust negative association here. So if we plot each of our 80 videos here with the two axes of like people's liking ratings and people's performability ratings, what we see here is that people really liked watching most those movies that they absolutely couldn't perform, and they weren't as interested in watching the ones that they said they could do. This makes a lot of sense, because what were the videos that people really liked watching? Well, these were the female ballet dancer kind of bringing her um, leg up in a developpe right by her ear as she had, perfect poise, or the male dancer doing a plie and then, 4 turns in the air while landing with perfect aplomb. So, or like really fancy jumps or splits or things that were kind of the body was taken to its extreme. Whereas in the ones that people didn't really like, this were the dancers just doing some port de bras movements or walking in a circle or kind of stretching up and touching the ground. So things that were far, far less complex. People said, yeah, I can do those, but I'm not that keen to watch them. So this is where kind of we got this idea of, it's like Cirque du Soleil. You pay a lot of money to go see spectacular things on stage. You don't necessarily, there's always exceptions to this rule, fork out good money to see someone doing with their body in a performing arts context things that you could easily do yourself, or so you think. So in terms of what we see in the brain, we don't need to get into great detail here. We do see some higher level visual regions, which is what you see on that brain figure on the left. But the brain figure on the right, these are kind of slices that are taken kind of this way through the brain. We see a little kind of engagement there in the right interparietal sulcus. And this was actually quite an exciting region, because it does suggest that this is a brain region that is interested in embodiment, that's interested in action and perception links. So it's not just vision, it's not just reward. We see a role for the body as well. So we've seen that with kind of dance naive people looking at expert dancers, but now we want to ask what happens to aesthetics when we actually practice or learn. Does the Cirque du Soleil effect hold, or does something different happen? So now we're going to look at some of our lab-based dance training, and we do use dance video games here. This is a very old system now, which I'm sure many people here have heard of or seen, if not, danced with before. But this is where we use the Xbox Connect system, which kind of provides really rudimentary motion tracking, but it's perfect for our purposes because what people are going to do is watch videos like this.
Right now, 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 now.
Or like this. Sorry if it's too loud.
Sitting here eating my heart out, waiting.
So people would watch kind of a minute and 30-second videos that kind of had lots of dance moves like this chained together, and they learn to do them while dancing in front of the video, the Xbox Connect there, and then the video game is able to kind of match from people's silhouettes how well they're actually matching in time and in space, what the dancers on screen are doing, and then it gives us a score. So we're not kind of devising something hugely sophisticated in terms of our own motion tracking setup. We're just kind of saying we're agnostic to how it's scoring people. It's giving us a score, and that's letting us understand how well people are learning these dance sequences that they've never done before and they have no dance experience. So I won't get into this in too much detail other than to say that we often have this sort of setup where have people come in, we have them do a bunch of questionnaires and rating scales, and we scan their brains while they watch a bunch of things that are completely novel to them. But then those things start to become more familiar because they come back to the lab day after day, sometimes week after week. And this one, it was just for 1 week. And they kind of learned how to dance some of the movements, or they just had some time watching some of the other movements, or watching the music videos, or they just listened to the soundtrack for others. And then there was one final set of movements that were completely, unfamiliar, remained unfamiliar. Then they came back and had their brain scanned again. And the idea was, okay, we should be seeing something different in your brain after you spent a week, really practicing with these dance moves. Dance videos and kind of watching your score improve as well. This should have some sort of impact on the brain. And then there's lots of questions we can ask about how it also impacts your aesthetic ratings, as well as, the extent to which visual experience alone might have an impact here. And um, we found a bunch of different things in this, but I'll just kind of give you a little bit of the overview here. We see that participant ratings based on training experience, if we kind of subtract our pre-training ratings from our post-training ratings, what this plot should show us is that if our colored bars are above the x-axis, that means that your rating should have improved. You should actually like something more or be able to reproduce it better. And if those bars go under the x-axis, that means the training had a negative impact and that you're even worse at doing something or you like it a lot less. And what we can see here is that kind of physically dancing with these music videos or just sitting there and watching the music videos without doing any dance experience, that led to increase ratings of how much people liked them. So we can see those red and orange bars on the left there are kind of significantly above the kind of no change 0 line there, but also how well they can reproduce things. So again, we see that in both um, those that you physically practice. That makes a lot of sense. You should be able to do something if you physically practiced it, but it's kind of interesting that you also believe that your performance has improved for those things that you only watched and kind of listen to the music videos for. And we do have actual performance data to suggest that yes, that is reflected by reality. So in terms of what we see in the brain, we can see that there's kind of an migration in the brain of our dance naive participants who are then learning to do some kind of simple street hip hop dance with this dance video game. When they're watching these movies before they have any experience, we see these really deep parts of the brain where those red arrows are pointing out, which are associated with reward processing. So they're kind of limbic brain regions, emotional regions, which have to do with kind of emotional and affective processing of things. But after you've spent a week embodying these movements, now we see that the brain regions that are really kind of tracking with the reward value of them are moving out to more lateral parts of the brain, in particular the right superior temporal gyrus and the right superior temporal sulcus. And if you have, a very basic understanding of the human cortex and what's going on with mirror neuron type activity, you might remember that the spherotemporal sulcus in particular is a region that's implicated in multisensory integration. So kind of bringing together movement and music and videos, all of these things together. So it seems like, this dance experience is starting to shape people's the aesthetic response in this kind of embodied way as well. Um, yes, I think actually there's a picture of Scott de la Junta there in that top image. What we can kind of conclude overall from this work is that the relationship between what we can do and what we like watching is non-linear, linear, subtle, and complex, as are the underpinning brain mechanisms. And in fact, we have been working kind of based on what these findings were in the study I just showed you to do some follow-up work with the Forsyth Company when they still existed in Frankfurt as part of this Dance Engaging Science project, which your very own Scott de la Junta was a huge instrumental part of. So just to say a few words about this, and I will stop talking soon so Simon and I can have more of a chat. This is some work that came from the Dance Engaging Science project with Guido Orgs, who was at Goldsmiths until last month and is now at UCL, and Andrea Orlandi, who's actually doing a Marie Curie postdoc with me in Sydney and Zurich. And this was some really cool work that came out 2 years ago in Cognition, where we looked at kind of aspects of performance dynamics, performance feasibility, and expertise and how these all shape people's aesthetic responses. We had some brain and behavioral measures, and we worked with this phenomenally talented dancer from the Forsyth Company, Riley Watts. And we have so many beautiful stimuli where we looked at kind of his choreographic choices and how these kind of impact people's perception. And to not go into this in great detail, but some plots from this study, we do find that both the speed that a dancer moves at and the perceived effort that they display both have a positive impact on enjoyment ratings and a negative impact on reproducibility ratings. And kind of the long and short of this study, there's a lot of really, I think, subtle and elegant data analyses that Andrea really spearheaded for this work. But we really kind of see among these dance naive people more evidence for something that looks like the Cirque du Soleil effect. So people really liked watching this Forsyth Company dancer when he was doing really complex, kind of effortful movements that they felt like they couldn't possibly reproduce. So there's more to that study than that, but that's kind of one of the take-home points. I'll finish with two very quick slides with some more recent work that I've been doing with a recent postdoc and PhD student. One of them looking at kind of universal primitives or anthropological universals about people's appreciation of not just performing arts, but the fine arts as well. This is some really cool work that Kohinoor Darda, who now has started up her own art science foundation in India, she was doing, looking at kind of developing a unifying model of visual art appreciation and looking at the role of expertise in culture. So that's a really nice study that I recommend having a look at. And these pictures have all gone to slightly funny places. I'm not quite sure why. But we're also doing some stuff with Kohinoor looking at kind of human agents and robotic agents with this really elegant Bharatanatyam choreography that she's working on with. And we're trying to see how kind of putting this movement onto different types of agents is influencing people's aesthetic evaluations and their, you know, preferences for these things. And this is one of the little bits of robot work we're doing, but there's a lot more that I'm not talking about today. There's also some really nice work done by a recent PhD student of mine from Glasgow, Rebecca Smith, looking at kind of higher order social constructs that shape aesthetic reactions to dance movements. And she's doing some really cool stuff as well, where she takes these traces and kind of looks at the choreography and kind of this two-dimensional representation like you see here. And we're trying to understand if choreographic choices kind of translate to other representations and how these shape people's perceptions. And the last bit that she's doing as well, and I think this is, never mind that this video isn't quite playing, but that's okay. We're trying to understand these skinned multi-personal linear modeling effects, as well as dynamic multi-person linear modeling approaches to understand how we might be able to reproduce dancers' movements on different types of avatars, whether human or non-human. And yeah, this is some really cool work that's hopefully still moving forward with some colleagues from the Royal Institute of Technology there in Stockholm. Right. So I will wrap up now and tell you that what I hope you've learned from this short whirlwind tour from some of the work we've done with dancers, embodiment, and neuroscience is that examining how experience shapes brain function as well as our behavior and how we perceive others, how we moving around us in the social world. This has been a big aim of ours that we've worked on for the past decade and a half or so. We're really interested in how the brain is asking and answering questions when it sees other people, such as, can I do that with my own body? Have I seen that before? Do I like watching that? How emotionally arousing is that to me? And in a nutshell, we found that very strongly so, our prior physical and visual experiences profoundly shape how we perceive as well as derive aesthetic pleasure from others that we see moving around us. Yes, in dance contexts, but yes, in non-dance contexts as well. So why is this interesting? Why is it important? Well, I would like to make the strong case that research examining how our bodily experiences shape brain, behavior, and aesthetics underscore the variety and complexity of embodied experience on how we operate in this social world. And as we become ever more sucked into our screens and kind of taken by what artificial intelligence can create for us in all manner of things, let's not forget the intelligence that's in the body and how our own bodily experiences are rapidly and profoundly changing kind of how we experience the world. So I'd like to thank many of my fabulous team members who you see here, lots of the funders that we've had over the years, and of course, thank you all for listening. And now I can stop talking one-dimensionally, and we can start to have a conversation and also take some questions. So I will stop share. All right.
Sorry, thanks, Emily. I'm just getting a strange. Thank you so much. I'm getting a very strange pop-up in Zoom saying, "Would you like to unmute?" Yes. And I wasn't quite sure what to push, what to do. Thank you so much. I feel a little bit. It was indeed a whirlwind, but I'm glad you didn't break the rule that every dance presentation about science has to include a photo of Scott Delahunter at some point. So thank you for maintaining his unbroken record.
My pleasure.
Yeah, yeah. I'm wondering where to start. I think I'm going to start just where you kind of were just leaving off then, and that is, and perhaps it's a slightly obvious question in that what is the relationship between activation in the brain, let's say part of the motor cortex or some part of the brain that's connected with human movement, and our sense of lived experience? That is, that activation in the brain is some kind of proxy for how it is that we are and what it is that we experience in the world. What's your sense of that, or making sense of that?
Yeah, so our lived experience and, whether that's embodied or whether it's visual, and there's kind of remaining debate as to how much needs to be embodied and how much can either be imagined. And of course, virtual reality is bringing lots of questions here about kind of virtual experience that's not um, what we've experienced in the kind of tangible embodied real world around us. But we know that the brain is this imprinting machine, and it's constantly being influenced by every conversation, every thought, every kind of movement we make. Now, these have to be kind of built up and perhaps attended to in conscious ways in order to have really kind of profound impacts on the brain. But we do know that like the brain's always changing. The brain's incredibly dynamic. They're long gone is the theory that all of the brain building and development takes place during development, and up until adolescence or until you're 25, and after that everything kind of starts to drop off into old age. We know that's not the case at all. We know that experience continues to shape, to change, to kind of update those neural connections until the most advanced age possible. So yeah, we're not untouched, we're not unchanged by these embodied experiences we have. How much we're changed and how much we're impacted, there's lots of questions about individual differences, and doing human neuroscience work like this doesn't lend itself well to ask questions about individual differences. They're interesting questions though, but I think we do know that all these experiences are shaping and changing us, not just like in a abstract cognitive way, but even in a very clear neurobiological way.
Okay, then, and so it really struck me that and again, I'm going to just plead naivety here, but there's something about, I'm going to read you something, and it's basically my question is, what is perception? And so it feels like that's probably like, 101, but I'm going to read you something. This is from Anil Seth's book, Being You. When trying to form perceptions, all the brain has to go on is a constant barrage of electrical signals, which are only indirectly related to things out there in the world, whatever they may be. That is, we never experience sensory signals themselves, only interpretations of them. Where does perception sit in that quite complex thing about this, our brains being effectively in the dark, quite literally in the dark?
Yeah, so perception, just as Anil Seth says in his book there, it's a representation, it's a construct that we make in order to make sense of this world. So indeed, every lots of people who kind of aren't so keen on the neurobiological explanation of the world kind of don't like hearing this sometimes, but every single thing we think, feel, smell, see, experience in any way, it's the result of neurobiological activity happening between our ears. So there's so that's just, I think, what Anil Seth's trying to say in that quote there. So yes, we form these kind of coherent representations, and our brains are very good at that, and that's what kind of we build up as perception. And I don't have enough of an evolutionary biology perspective to say that the primitive eye was able to kind of take light and kind of knit it together to then understand shadow and then understand shape and understand form. But there's I'm sure a long neurobiological history for how we are able to kind of form these constructs. Um, but then because we are very good at this and we are good at perceiving the world, then what's happening in this kind of myriad of signals that Neil Seth talks about is we're trying to predict what's happening, because that makes it a lot easier for us to understand um, how we're supposed to behave and like interact with our world. If we were always reacting to what was coming in perceptually around us from our eyes and ears, we'd be really too far behind. It's the case with language as well. So our brain is it's so exquisitely sensitive to all the experience we have in younger life and then continuing on throughout life, that we're able to have effortless, fluent conversations and move with each other, and kind of I'll just there's tons of examples, but these don't rely on reacting to what we see into percepts, but to kind of predicting what's going to happen next.
It made me think, about this, these really kind of quite neat and tidy experiments to do with liking in relation to expertise, and it got me thinking about well, two things. One is the expectation that I would like it. That is, for want of better, all the kind of training and all my kind of let's say my immersion in the art form, that is, that I end up with the expectation of liking it, which seems to, or potentially seems to be different from the actual liking. And then the second thing is this really kind of curious thing about virtuosity, that what you described as the Cirque du Soleil effect seems it seems to make a lot of sense, that we're drawn to things that we can't do ourselves, highly virtuosic things. And yet, as I've and I think there's the sort of whole history of contemporary dance really is a little bit like returning and pushing away and reacting against that. And certainly as I've got more and more experienced, my curiosity and interest about those kinds of virtuosic things is diminished enormously. And I'd far rather be watching you kind of deal with your hands and figuring out how to sit in front of a computer monitor than that. And so there's a couple of things there, and I wonder maybe just to respond to them.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, really interesting things to unpack there. So I'll start with the virtuosity thing because it's the recency effect there. You're absolutely right, and I think this would be like a whole other incredibly interesting body of research to develop, looking at things having to do with performance art and like maybe a reaction away virtuosity. I mean, I have to say, like from my years and certain styles of contemporary dance training, I don't think there's any less virtuosity and outstanding performance. It's just not as showy. It's not as like crazy, like man on the street
Yeah.
per se could pick that out. It's a different kind of perhaps quieter, more subtle
Yeah.
virtuosity. But you know um when we're looking at
It's not
dance naive
explicit
observers, it's
virtuosity
not
or something like that.
explicit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
seen in the same way. So I think and there's been some really interesting work in this space, and perhaps some of the folks in this Zoom call have even done some of this work, looking at how expertise, and it's not just in dance, it's in visual arts and painting and other things as well. Like the more kind of expert you become, and especially in certain aspects and niche, then the more you kind of like the Cirque du Soleil effect, or like the really kind of like common tropes in art production, they don't work on you, and you're kind of you're looking beyond that, you're seeing beyond that. So I think expertise kind of continues to shape your sensibilities and your preferences categorically. And in
Mhm.
dance, yes, we know that's the case. And again, I think it's sometimes a really frustrating thing for dance audiences to hear this work. And I I appreciate this. I hear this point, and you're seen by me, because it's like you're asking people how much they like it. That's not what dance is about. You're showing these like 3-second segments. How can you possibly call that dance? I get it. The dancer in me
I didn't
gets
have
it.
that reaction, but yeah.
Yeah, well, we always get that. I always get that. My team
Yeah,
does.
sure.
But it's more that we're trying to find a way to build these duets between science, neuroscience, and performing arts in a way that does enable us to actually get a little bit of a grip on things. But yeah. So sorry. Can you go back to the first part of your question, because I was
And
swept up by
yeah,
the
and that was the
virtuosity.
expectation. That was the
Ah,
expectation one. Yeah.
yeah. So that's a really, really good question as well. And in some ways, the expectation, this is why we like to use implicit measures, not just explicit measures, because if you're a dancer and we're showing you dance and asking you how much you like it, then of course there's this kind of, expectation. Oh, I'm a dancer. I should, like, I put my dance hat on now and think about how I like this in a dance way. And all of that shapes perception. And we know that. So having things like these EMG measures, which kind of give us very subtle implicit things when you're not thinking at all about how much you like it, because that's not the task right now. The task is something totally different. That allows us to kind of, pull away a little bit from these expectation effects. And yeah, we know these biases can absolutely shape things, but we're always trying to find more effective ways to kind of sidestep them, or at least know the role that expectation is playing in people's responses.
Mm. Thank you. Maybe I'll just ask one last. I'm just also phenomenally aware of my corrugator frowning muscles now. As I've got older, they just seem to just be turned on the whole time, which is just terrible. I'm going to just finish with one thing, and then we'll have a little break, and then we can open it out to the rest of the group. And this is, I'm going to. I think this probably represents a sort of curiosity of mine. Randolph Ness is who works in the field of evolutionary medicine, and he's write this thing about a soma is a soma shaped by natural selection. And one of the things he describes is that he writes this: our bodies have parts with blurry boundaries, multiple functions, unimaginably complex connections, and no designer's purpose underlining the whole system, hence the evolutionary aspect. And I guess it made me think about your work and the kind of work you've just presented. And I wonder, where are the blurriest aspects of your research and understanding, the lacunae? What are the things that perhaps these technologies of measurement are most poorly equipped and best equipped to gauge and get a sense? I guess I'm really interested. Where are the edges for you? Where the things do you feel least certain, or most uncertain?
I think there's a lot of edges. I think there's a lot of things where we're kind of put into these very tiny and narrow boxes by the technological limitations, especially with brain scanning that we have right now. And that makes us kind of reduce and reduce and reduce the dance and the kind of artistic part to like just little flavors, just little hints. And I think that that's deeply unsatisfying often to artistic audiences, and rightly so. Um, I try to counter that with we have to start somewhere, and this is a starting point. But I do think um, the reductionism comes at a great cost, and I'm hoping that as technologies advance and move forward, and one of the technologies we're working with more and more these days, in fact, we have a really cool kind of different type of arts engagement study that's going on in 2 offices behind me right now, we're able to use mobile brain imaging, and that at least allows people to be upright and kind of behaving in the world and having social interactions and in theory dancing. We're not quite there yet. We've done some like arm movement stuff, but it's not quite dance. Um, but that frees people from like the very claustrophobic, you have to lie super still lying on your back watching videos of dance. So to kind of start to get not just the observation perspective but the performance perspective, this is, I think, a really exciting place. And I think a lot of people who are interested in the future of dance neuroscience research or like embodiment research, they're going to want to see more and more of working with this technology in a way that doesn't keep the body kind of tightly constrained and so well controlled.
Sorry, just to finish, because one of the things you said at the beginning was about the kind of complexity of dancing, and I guess, and I'm not trying to make out. I'm not sure that dance is so special, but is it different, for example, from the complexity of an activity like gymnastics? Are there particular things about dancing that you're seeing or that you've noticed in your work, other than it being something that you've been curious about because you were a dancer or are a dancer?
So I think there's two answers to that. One is that, and I, way back in the day was also on the high school gymnastics team, so a bit of firsthand experience with that. But is there something special about dance? Well, I think the biggest thing I would say, just point blank there, is that dance is more social than gymnastics. Now, of course, you can have rhythmic gymnastics, you can have team gymnastics, but it's not social in the same way. It's not about relationships per se, and dance isn't always about relationships, but dance is often about relationships, even the relationship between the
Mm,
dancer and the audience. Whereas gymnastics, yeah, the gymnast and the judge, maybe. But I think like the performing arts aspect, yes, they share ground, but there's, I think, a lot of distinctness to them as well. So
yeah.
I do think dance is special in that way, because you have a whole encyclopedia of sporting activities, but the extent to which the performance aspects and the social aspects and the communicative aspects are involved, it's different across everything, and dance does stick out somewhere in that space, to me, for those very reasons.
Great. So thank you so much. Such a pleasure to have a little chat with you. We're going to just take just 2 or 3 minutes, everyone, just to have a chance to go to the toilet, stretch your legs, have a snack, whatever you need to do, and then we'll come back and open out questions to everyone. So thanks. See you in a bit. Thanks, Emily.
Pleasure. I'm going to grab a quick snack. I'll be right back too.
You do that.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure what the best thing to do is here, Lilia. Maybe you've got a thought on this, is whether people want to ask their questions in the flesh. Not quite right, but you know what I mean. As opposed to just reading them out in the chat. Do you have a sense of that, Lily?
Yeah, I think if people are happy to come onto, come on camera and unmute and ask their questions, I think that would be great. But no pressure.
Great. Okay, and
that's fine.
yeah, there's no pressure. So if you'd rather that the question was read out, so let's start with Mary Price O'Connor, and I don't know if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question, or should I just read it out?
No, I'm okay. I'll just be very brief. I'm curious about the relationship that music might play within this research at all. And it might be one of those areas you go, yeah, that's put to one side for somebody else to look at, because it struck me during the Xbox practice learning section. So I thought I'd ask that question because that's my area of research.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, the music question is super interesting. Now, there is a very well established, well regarded like whole field of music neuroscience, and so we know a lot about music in the brain, but the relationship between music dance in the brain we know a lot less about, because it's hugely complex relationship. So we have found that, funnily enough, the kind of more experience with the music that people had in our studies, the more they started to like really dislike the music. So it was almost like the more experience they had with dancing and watching the movements, the more they liked it. But the music, they kind of just got so bloody sick of it by the end. So that was, you know, one study, and we've seen that in a few studies that we've done. But that's kind of, but I don't think that's a really fair appraisal, like what's the relationship is between music and dance, because obviously that wasn't quite what we set out to study in that way. It was just kind of an epiphenomenal finding that we reported. And I think to study music and dance together really well is difficult. There are some people doing it, and I always, though, kind of, you know, take a bit of umbrage when people say like you can't have dance without music, because I completely disagree with that definition. I think you can definitely have dance without music. So when we do sometimes strip out the music with our dance stimuli, which is often the case, just for simplicity's sake, and also when you're scanning people's brains, the scanner is so bloody loud that if you're trying to listen to the soundtrack on top, and we've done it before, but it's not anything like a real world experience of watching music and dance, as you know, outside of the scanner. And I think that auditory aspect in particular is really degraded. But in other situations where you don't have this competing auditory stimulus, you can add music back in, and I think it is important. But I'm just open to doing more about music and to knowing more about it. But I know that music in and of itself is such a well developed field.
Cool. Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
And Sarah,
Thanks.
oh, sorry, Mary. Sarah, do you want to ask a question, or would you rather I just read it out from the?
I can ask. It's hard to articulate. Thank you so much, Emily. I'll be brief because there are a lot of really interesting questions to follow. Yeah, I was kind of struck by this effect of dancers not being that interested in the kind of the spectacular, more kind of entertainment level dancing. And I was kind of thinking of my own experience and thinking, well, that kind of depends on the style of dance I might be watching. I can be really impressed with, let's say, some really amazing hip hop, or I don't have experience in that. I have not done that, but I may be less drawn to kind of you know, kind of yeah, maybe classical ballet or postmodern dance that's trying to kind of be more than it is, or I don't know, sort of like I'm more nuanced. So I'm just wondering if there's more nuance in there, and I'm sure it is in your research. You didn't have time to go there, but I was just curious about that demographic of who are those dancers, what is that training, and does it differentiate the way that they might respond, or what they're drawn to or not?
You're absolutely right. And I think expertise, like so many things that I've talked about here, is far from a unitary phenomenon. And again, individual differences, like in this type of research and the type of brain scanning, human neuroscience research, we're trying to see, you know, what's common across people. What can we say, like, you know, at a population level, we can see that these brain regions kind of pop up. And therefore, we think that there's some sort of, you know, population level, not, you know, worldwide human level, but just like on our population, this seems to be playing a role. But the individual differences that people actually have, and here when you bring expertise to the table, I think it becomes even more interesting, because every expert's route to their expertise and kind of perception and one way that they kind of sit with their art and their practice is different. We're looking for commonalities, not because it's too difficult, and you know, you're looking at case studies then, which are really interesting, but they're not telling us the same thing about as commonalities. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's also important to make the distinction maybe between being like impressed by something and liking something, because those can also be quite different. You can be really impressed, but not like, I'm dying to see that again. You just be like, that was cool, next. And I think that sort of relationship is one that, especially when in aesthetics and in empirical aesthetics, it's great that it's this really well developed field. You know, well before neuroscience stuck its nose in, empirical aesthetics had a lot to say about, you know, from the time of, you know, classical philosophers forward, about, you know, the pleasurable feelings we derive from certain stimuli in our environment. But yeah, it's a very, very complex relationship, and I think your point is very well taken, that it's not necessarily the case that expertise points you in one direction or another, and it can be very style specific. That's not a terribly conclusive answer, but yes, it's complex, and I think I like the way you're thinking about that question.
Thank you.
It reminds me of that, you know, we often used to say our response was, I didn't hate it. There's very nuanced. Alison, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Emily, for that fantastic presentation. It's not really a question as such. It was just, I was really interested in what you were talking about in terms of virtuosity and expertise and how those things were perceived. And for me, my area of research is dynamics and the sensation of dynamic expressivity as well as the outward appearance. And so from a choreological perspective, so my work draws from Laban's theories of effort and choroitic space harmony. And I'm looking in particular at how dancers are trained to perform very inorganic movement efficiently. So give that impression of being effortless when in fact it's quite effortful. And so I use the term dynamic camouflage, you know, to actually sort of try and capture what that is. And so, of course, there is that dichotomy about how something feels in relation to how it's observed and how it is seen on the outside. And so, yeah, it was just a comment really to say about how that's portrayed by the dancer. You know, for example, I give the example about how you land from a jump with a light impact. So you have to consciously control those dynamics because, of course, you have the effect of gravity. But it's about how that embodied knowledge provides an informed corporeal insight then into the complexities of that kind of dynamic movement vocabulary for somebody who does understand that rather than somebody who hasn't experienced it, and so contributes to what you term sort of aesthetic evaluations. And yeah, just was really interested in that aspect of your presentation, so thank you.
I think it's super interesting stuff, and if you have any interest, I'd really recommend reading that, checking out that paper by Orlandi, Cross and Orgs, I think 2022, maybe 2021, in Cognition, because this piece, and we only looked at naive dancers, but it was really, really interesting, the perceived effort that people were seeing, and like again with this beautiful dancer from the Forsyth Company. Like I was really surprised at some of the things that we saw emerge from our data there, with like people really thought that this smooth movement looked much more effortful than the dynamic one that kind of had all of the kind of direction changes emphasized in a really different way. And I was like, it's not what I see at all, but necessarily, but you know, it's this how you perceive and like how your embodied experience, you know, shapes, like, you know, that how difficult it is, you know. And of course dancers, you know, who, you know, lift their leg up next to their ear with that flexibility, they need to make it look as light and easy as possible, but many of us know that yes, that requires a lot of effort. But I think your question also points at a potentially interesting research direction, which is another kind of real deep interest of mine, but it's in kind of knowledge cues and knowledge. So like if you give someone like a little vignette that explains like when dancers do this, it is very difficult and it takes years of training to make it, you know. So if you start to understand the effort involved in making something look so light and easy, I do think that that will fundamentally shape the way you perceive something. So maybe it won't shape your aesthetic response per se, but I'm guessing the brain's gonna, you can have this top down effect where the brain starts to say like, oh, I understand there's a lot more going on there than, you know, meets the eye initially, but this knowledge starts to inform your perception. And I think that kind of bi-directional relationship between not just what you see in front of you, but what you bring to it in your own knowledge, that could be through expertise, or that could also just be being told about how this training happens. I think that's a really interesting area for exploration.
Scott.
Oh, thanks, Emily. It was great to see some of that work again. But my question you can see in the chat. It's about the wondering whether or not, because I'd like to start with your very last sentence in your very last slide. The notion that, you know, that in a sense you've evidenced a lot of this, this shaping the bodily experience, the embodiment, shaping emotions, shaping intellect, so into intelligence. So you have a sense that it's essential somehow to the full human experience. But once you evidence that enough, like once you get to the point where the question is whether or not your team, I suppose, is involved in also trying to shape policy, education policy. Where does that information go? It's kind of implied in your very last sentence about underscoring variety and complexity, but you know, it's kind of an assumption that it seems that variety and complexity is valuable. Do we know it's so? I wonder, where do you go with this evidence beyond recapitulating more studies? You know, this sort of get to finer
Yep.
grain detail, kind of expand the range of possibilities in terms of mechanisms and stuff. But how do you really change? How do you change stuff, things people think about the value of embodiment?
So it's a really good question. And in terms of policy, it's funny you asked that, because like one of the very first set of studies I did still during my PhD, they were partially funded by the Dana Foundation back in the States. And my PhD supervisor and I wrote a chapter for the Dana Foundation kind of about, dance changing and shaping the brain. And that whole collection that was in was kind of geared towards educational policy people. But I've not really picked up that thread a lot since then. I mean, I did during my PhD, I taught children's creative dance and absolutely loved that. And like, through that experience, saw how, important and meaningful it is. And of course, my research insights kind of inform that perception even more. But my team hasn't really stepped into the policy domain yet. We're doing a lot of policy stuff, but that's kind of more the AI and robotics side of things, and that keeps us busy in the policy domain. But I do think that this work, what I do spend some time talking about to whoever's interested, is that I think it really does argue against living through screens and living in screens and things like virtual reality. I think these technologies are very exciting, and of course they can open lots of new doors, but the embodied world, the physical world, I know we're all on screens right now. I really wish I could be there in Coventry, but there's also, finite time resources and environmental impacts and all these things. So I'm happy that we can have these conversations on a screen, but it is not the same. And the human brain and body has not evolved for kind of two-dimensional screen-based interactions. It has evolved to move. It has evolved to, be physically active in the world. And I think this work shows just how sensitive our brains are to that, and by extension of that, yes, I do believe this work, with very little kind of manipulating, it could be used for to support educational policy for getting more dance in schools, and it's definitely more embodied learning, definitely less sitting on bums and staring at screens.
Yeah, that's cool. I definitely vote for more of that kind of work from.
All right, good. We'll take that into consideration. Do what we can.
Thanks, Emma.
I vote for sitting on our bums more. No, thanks, Scott. So Adele Quinn in the chat just asks, or just thanks you, Emily, and says, from a neural perspective, is embodied experience of prior movement solely a feature of the brain, i.e. specific brain locations associated with particular action responses or memory stores, or embodied experience of prior movement experiences considered to exist at the whole being, i.e. at a full body mind / cellular / multi-systems level?
It's a few ways to answer this. I guess the simplest and perhaps most unsatisfying answer is I'm thinking of those as the same thing. Like the brain, is kind of the signal conducting center for the whole, full mind-body interface. So it is at a cellular level, but that cellular level is supporting the multi-systems level, and the cellular level is supporting the mind-body, soul level. So I think these things, they all kind of have synaptic, neurobiological, biochemical foundations, but they are therefore, talking about muscle memory, like that's also, I would say, that's still coordinated by the brain. And yes, it means it's just super efficient pathways to certain, to muscles, to certain patterns, to certain movements, but which is embodied, but it's all kind of coming through the control center, which is the kind of neurobiological machinery that's in the brains. So it's kind of hard to answer that in a very succinct way, Adele, because I kind of see those as being one and the same, but kind of more the second piece, yes, is what I'm seeing as the multi-system cellular full mind body, but that's all kind of coming back to the neurobiology that's at the foundation.
Why was that answer unsatisfactory? Why did you prelude that answer for it?
Because I feel like Adele's question is trying to say that those are two different things, and I guess I don't really see them as two different things. I kind of see them as one and the same, but that's why maybe that's not.
Gotcha. Thank you. Zrinka, would you like to? Yeah, great.
Yeah, I can try to pose this as a question. Thank you, Emily. Really really fascinating research, decade long. I'm wondering, so I'm now struggling with one book, and I'm wondering whether you are familiar with it, because I'm not sure if I understand it well. So I was wondering about the book, The Brain from Inside Out by Georgi Bousaki. I hope I pronounced
I don't know this. I should write this down.
Well, he also votes for action-based thinking process, and in a way voting for kind of a radical stance that a human being meets the world from inside out as well as outside in, but somehow neuroscience very often bases that it comes from outside in, and then we have these representations in our brain to kind of correspond to it or to act upon it, but he votes for the inside out. So moving through the world, we are learning. It's somehow what you were saying as well. But then Simon posed a question about the perception, and you talked a little bit about the representations, and that's why I remembered this book. And I wonder, is a decision-making process that's happening through this felt experience, is it avoiding representations sometimes, inducing effects that are not transferable in that way, more palpable, like pleasure, desire, fear? Are those still representations, or can we call it differently? And I don't know if this is even relevant to ask in this way.
No, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not going to profess like deep expertise in this, but I think, when we talk about these representations that are kind of built up from what's in the world, it's this, my understanding, and I think most perceptual neuroscientists and phenomenologists would agree, it isn't just a bottom-up construct. It's all being filtered through our top-down priors, our expectations, our moods, our feelings, our fears, our thoughts, our emotions. So it's kind of what's coming into the outside world being colored by everything that we bring to the table. So I think that kind of outside in, inside out perspective is really nice, because I do think it's both things. And we do know that so much of our perception is constructed from, our prior experiences. It's not just this fidelity between what's out there and then kind of what representation is that, so that if we're all staring at the same red coat, we all have the same experience of the red coat. No, there's some things that we'll share, but then we'll all have our unique kind of flavors that we add to that percept. So I think that's like keeping that in mind. It's a lot to keep in mind sometimes, and I think especially to people who are newer to these ideas, and trying to understand like, okay, so what's kind of the more philosophical phenomenological part, and what's the more neurobiological part? Like, they are all interrelated, but it's sometimes hard to pull the threads apart and understand what's contributing to what, I would say.
Cool. If I can just quickly ask one more like intricate question, because I'm coming from dance field. I was wondering, when you were saying about the neuroaesthetics, in terms of thinking, if we think of dancers being disciplined, and sometimes you have to look at the things that you don't like, but you still have to learn them. Do you start liking it after a while?
That's a really good question. I don't think that's been empirically explored, but my prediction is that yes. And maybe to be able to perform something really well, I mean, I guess I know from my own experience, like stuff I don't like is oftentimes stuff that I'm really not able to get fluently and smoothly and perform it well myself. So it's like, oh, I hate this part, because I'm always like not quite getting it. And my guess is, there's some relationship between, dislike of movement and performance ability and aesthetics. And maybe when, I think it's an interesting question. You could definitely explore it. It lends itself well to study.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zrinka. Jonas, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hello. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful seminar and discussion, Emily. I just really feel like meeting my academic star today. So I just, honestly,
it's very kind.
I've been extremely inspired by your work to my doctoral studies. And as I posted on the comments, my work is around using art science to create an experimental creative work. investigating, focusing on the movement improvisation, responsive movement improvisation influenced by music and environmental sounds.
Cool.
And I'm really keen to hear your perspectives on movement improvisation with the brain, as I posted there, and as well as because we read a lot research that's coming about, merging science with dance, but there's not many practices coming out, like art sci practices, that not simply influenced by science, but actually in a more data-driven approach, data-driven perspective, if that makes sense. And if you think this is linked with the neuroaesthetic or the new approaches of practicing science, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wow, Johannes, these are some really, really good questions, really big questions. So just one thing that my mind immediately sprang to when you spoke about your interest in improvisation. Since the start of this last academic year, I've been working with I think, industrial engineer called Simon. What's Simon's last name? It'll come to me in 1 second. Anyways, he's a engineering professor at EPFL, but he's also a professional improvising dance. I don't know what the words are, but like he performs the improvisation dance company, and he has had this course at EPFL in Lausanne in Switzerland for the past maybe 6 years called Improgeneering. And EPFL students are all engineering and science and architecture. Architecture is as artsy as it gets there. And he offers this course every year. It's a year-long course called Improgeneering, and like the students love it. It is taught solely by dancers, by theater artists, by voice improvisers, but these students learn how to improvise. And these are students who have done nothing like this. They have no arts background, no training, but they have a curiosity about this. And kind of the insights that come from this course are really quite stellar. And they all have to like come up together and do this performance at the end too, which is crazy. I've seen videos of some of them, but anyways, he's so interested in why this works and why learning about movement improvisation, and it's all movement and dance based. Like they have stuff in from theater and from voice, but like ultimately it's all about movement and dance improvisation. He wants to know how and why this like results in better scientific practice. So it's moving in that direction. It's not moving in the science, making the arts better, but it's understanding how movement improvisation can inform science. And now there's a PhD student that he and I are working with that is trying to actually, in a scientific but also a qualitative way, pull apart what it is about learning to improvise movements that is so effective in transferring to engineering skills. So that's kind of a little side note there, but I think it's really interesting. And I think you're right that there is a lot of interest in this crosstalk between the arts and science, but what do we get from it? Like, how does it improve the science? How does it improve the arts? And sometimes we're kind of left with like, oh, there is this really cool installation, or there's this really cool show or documentary or product that came out, but it's not necessarily telling us about the fields or moving the boundaries of the fields. So I think this is a really, really good point. And I do think neuroaesthetics hold some potential. And I really like that there's like so many of the people working in dance neuroaesthetics come from and have deep interest in performing arts and dance backgrounds, because I think that maintains a fidelity to the art side of things. But there's still this tension, and I don't think we're quite hitting the nail on the head with really coming up with questions and then answers that are useful to artists. And yes, more collaboration, more interdisciplinarity. This is something we've been hearing and talking about, especially with Scott, for years and years. But it's hard, and it's hard to necessarily crack that in a way that's useful. But it sounds like you are working right in this space, and that's exciting.
I mean, it is exciting. Thank you so much for your insights. I'll be very brief because conscious about the time. It is very challenging and very difficult proposing a PhD, practice-based PhD that uses fMRI scans from 10 performers and then, analyze the data, but then create something out of it. That it has been very challenging for me to persuade people that has value. And also, especially because there has been such an extensive research on music improvisation in the brain, but
so
not
much
with dance and theater. And I found it, fascinating, but also kind of unfair that theater and dance has been left outside of.
Yes. Oh, I will join you in that unfair comment. I agree. Yes, entirely.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. And thanks for organizing this lovely, lovely meeting.
Jonas, thank you. You did a very nice way of just finishing things off there for me. I don't need to say anything, but really, certainly on behalf of CDARE, Emily, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and your insight. It certainly has been a pleasure, not just today, but also in the lead up and the little bits of communication we've had leading up to today. I just want to say that for everyone, the next session in this series is with Heather Hauser. I've just put a link in the chat. And that is it's the 18th of April. She writes about science, the environment, and contemporary culture, very much alongside or parallel to the kind of work we're doing here at CDARE. So I'm super excited to meet with Heather, and hope you are too. But Emily, thanks once again. Everyone, thank you all for coming along. And we're all here on time and finishing on time, which is superb. And hope
Very
to see
Swiss.
you.
I salute it. Thank you very much.
No worries at all.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. See you later,
Thank
Emily.
you.
Take care.
Thanks all.